times the price as it was towards the end. With that gone, everything went to hell in a handbasket extremely quickly. So it was then, my friends, that the disruption and dislocation caused by the special period would penetrate deep into Cuban society. During this time, more than 1,000 people would go and protest the sinking of a tugboat of would-be immigrants in Havana Harbor, and 35,000 raft people, called balseros, would attempt the dangerous 90-mile journey to Miami on makeshift boats rather than endure conditions on the island. Many Cubans would experience the special period not only as a material crisis, but something that was also a crisis of their own internal politics, ideology, values, expectations, and faith that the state could continue forward on a path of progress and development with its communist ideals. For most people, seeing what was going on broke them of that faith. Thousands of Cubans would protest in Havana on the 5th of August 1994, with them chanting Libertad, or freedom. The protest, in which some of the protesters would throw rocks at police, were then dispersed by police forces after only a few hours. And this, crazily enough, is arguably the closest that the Cuban opposition would ever come to asserting itself decisively in the one-party state, which we're going to be touching upon here later because that's a crucial detail that one needs to understand. But either way, so it was then, my friends, that the government of Cuba had no real choice but to make some reforms to try and generate hard currency and rejoin international trade networks. To that end, the state would amend the Constitution to allow new forms of private and corporate property, regulate foreign investment, turn state companies into for-profit enterprises, and even, crazily enough, decriminalize the circulation of the US dollar, which that was a crime. International tourism was identified as a promising strategy, and state companies would remodel old hotels, worked with international partners to build new ones, and revamped small airports near beach areas to try and accommodate seasonal flight traffic from countries like Germany and Canada. But even with these and other limited reforms, the Cuban state was never really fixing itself in any meaningful way, and the special period, technically speaking, never really came to an end, which might sound confusing to some people because you would think, okay, well, if the special period never ended and things were that bad, why did Cuba not just collapse outright in the late 90s, going into the early 2000s? How did it last so long? And the answer to that, my friends, is Venezuela. In the early 2000s, Castro and Chavez, the respective leaders of both countries, would strike a barter deal that would pull Cuba from the depths of its economic crisis with generous amounts of petroleum. Venezuela would start sending Cuba around 100,000 barrels of oil a day, and in exchange, Cuban doctors would go and set up clinics for the poor, which was Chavez's political base, in Venezuela's most downtrodden neighborhoods, with thousands of Venezuelans then able to travel free of charge to Havana for medical treatment of just about every ailment that you could imagine, including cancer, which Chavez himself would eventually have to do. It really seemed to be an amazing deal, and it was. With oil flowing in from Venezuela, Cuba was able to pay off long-standing debts and revamp the island's faded tourism industry. The workers for oil deal would generate far more income than rum, cigars, or anything else that Cuba was able to produce. The island's citizens themselves became the main export of the state. Cuban workers could then return from postings in oil-rich Venezuela with hard-to-find imported goods like TVs and other gear that Cuba didn't make and they weren't able to buy elsewhere. It was genuinely an amazing deal from them, and both countries knew it. Chavez would take to proclaiming that Cuba and Venezuela were in fact not two countries at all, but a single one called La Gran Patria, or the Big Homeland. He frequently would go on over to Havana for strategy sessions and to just play baseball at night with Castro. There are so many pictures of exactly that. You need to understand this here, my friends. When I'm talking about this, these two countries were intertwined. They were connected at the hip and mutually dependent on one another. When I say that, this is not like Cuba's former relationship with the Soviet Union of subsidies, which was maintained only because of the ideological goals and Cuba's close proximity to the United States. No, this is something that between the two states, this was true codependence, with the cheap Venezuelan oil flooding Cuba. The mostly command-style economy of the state was, for a time, safe, with the deal accounting for some 40% of Cuba's entire GDP in some shape or form. For its part, Venezuela was able to maintain high rates of social services led by skilled foreign doctors from Cuba. It was something that really worked for them. And from that, things sort of returned back to normal, but barely so. To be honest, the politicians of both countries would tout this as a massive success, which, yes, it was a success, but as we've covered here before, it was truly nothing more than life support for the nations, which could easily at any point be cut. Am I foreshadowing this hard enough for you yet? Yes, my friends, change was going to come. In some way, somehow, whether either government liked it or not. And hint, hint, neither one did. When Raul Castro would formally take over from Fidel in 2008, he would inherit a system that was, in his own words, unsustainable. He knew that in the 21st century, the command-style economy simply was unviable, but his vision for reform was not to abandon socialism, but instead to make it more efficient. To do this, the plan that he had was to reduce the state's immense burden as the nation's largest employer. The state was responsible for anything and everything, from paying salaries to providing lunch for millions of workers, many who worked in redundant or non-productive roles that didn't actually help or contribute to an economy. It was just a job that one could get paid for, like a position in an office where you don't actually do any work, but you still collect a paycheck. The 2001 Lineamientos, or guidelines of the Communist Party, would then lay out a roadmap to do several things. First, lay off state workers, with the initial goal being to eliminate 1.8 million state jobs over several years. Two, to expand the private sector, with the government then legalizing over 200 different categories of cuentapropistas, or self-employed workers, such as restaurant owners called paladeres, bed and breakfast operators, the casas particulares, and taxi drivers, just to give you an idea of what it is that we're talking about. And so you understand just how important that part is, a taxi driver, in many cases, could make in one day what an engineer working for the Cuban state made over the course of a month. Yes, it was that broken. And finally, then, the third step were legal reforms, with the 2019 Constitution finally recognizing private property and allowing for the creation of small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, which are usually the backbone for any healthy economy. Which, when I'm talking about this here, my friends, it sounds pretty good. It does. It really does. But unfortunately for Cuba, these reforms would fail to have the impact that was hoped. These changes were simply far too little, far too late, and were actively being sabotaged by the state bureaucracy. Local Communist Party committees and government officials who were ideologically opposed to private wealth would oftentimes create obstacles, denying people licenses, imposing arbitrary fines, or simply making it impossible for private businesses to operate in the first place. Then, if you managed to somehow get your private business up and running, like in the case of a restaurant, you were still probably screwed because the owner could legally run a business, but they had no legal way to acquire food at wholesale prices. They were forced to buy ingredients at the same retail price as any regular customer, which made their business unviable except in the case of tourism. But for any regular Cuban, there was literally no reason to go to a restaurant. Like it wasn't something that was viable. And on top of all that, private businesses had no access to bank credit or investment to try and expand. And there was a constant fear of success itself. If a business became too successful and then tried to expand, the government could crack down at any point or just outright confiscate it. This prevented the kind of investment that was needed for growth. And as a result, the private sector that grew was extremely small, extremely fragile, and entirely dependent on state-run markets for its inputs. It just wasn't an efficient or good thing at all. But it's about to get worse. Because while Cuba's economy was already stagnating from 2018 to 2020, COVID as well as the Trump administration's policies would crank up the pressure on it even more. First up, tourism was outright crushed. The 2019 ban on cruise ships was a body blow before COVID put the whole thing in a stranglehold. Cruises were things that brought in day trippers who would spend money in concentrated areas. More significantly, the administration would restrict individual people-to-people travel, which had been a major loophole allowing Americans to visit. This slashed tourist arrivals from the US, which had been a growing market. The more reliable visits then from Canada, Europe, and other places Well, that would basically cease after the start of the pandemic, which would destroy the burgeoning industry. Besides that, another key source of cash that Cubans would get is from remittances. But Western Union was forced to shut down its operations in Cuba in 2020. This severed the primary legal channel for Cuban Americans to send money home. And while informal channels did exist, they were far riskier and more expensive, cutting off a critical source of income that directly sustained millions of families and acted as a small scale stimulus for the private economy. And then, on top of all of that, the activation of Title III of Helms-Burton Act was perhaps the most damaging long-term measure. This would allow Cuban Americans to sue international companies, including European and Canadian ones, that were trafficking in property that had been nationalized after the revolution. This created a massive chilling effect on business. International banks, fearing massive fines and loss of access to the US financial system, began to de-risk, refusing to process any transactions that were related to Cuba. This made it nearly impossible for Cuba to conduct international trade, even for humanitarian goods like food and medicine. It all ceased, or at least was slowing down, and then the pandemic happened. By 2020, Cuba was entering full meltdown territory, with its economy contracting by a whopping 10% that year. Of course, no singular issue would cause this, as a variety of factors would occur, including the pandemic and Trump policies that I mentioned just now, but also there was less subsidized fuel that was coming from Cuba's ally Venezuela, which had financially crashed at this point as well, as I've covered multiple times here before. Also, reforms that were attempted domestically proved to be utter disasters. See, the Cuban government would blame the crisis on the US trade embargo, as well as the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, but they neglected to mention their own awful decisions, such as the Tarea Ordomiento issue, which, to explain that, this, my friends, was the most significant domestic policy event of the crisis. The government's stated goal was to eliminate the distortions of the dual currency system that they had, but the execution of this was a disaster of historic proportions. To understand the context of what it is that I'm talking about, because I know there will be some confusion as people have never heard of this here before, for decades, the official rate of currency exchange had been 1 CUC, which is the Cuban exchange peso that only existed to be pegged to the dollar for Cubans to use since dollars had been illegal for so long. But anyway, that was equal to 1 US dollar, which was equal to 24 CUP, or normal Cuban pesos. That was the pegged rate. On the black market, however, 1 US dollar was worth a lot more. The Ordenamiento would go and eliminate the CUC, and it set a singular official exchange rate of 24 CUP to the dollar. Then it forced all state-owned enterprises to revalue their assets and restate their finances at this new rate, which, for anyone who's curious then, because again, the dollar was massively worth more on the black market, that instantly created these massive paper profits on the accounting books, which the government then used to justify a massive wage increase for state workers. The problem, though, was that the new exchange rate was a complete fabrication. The true value of the CUP was way lower. And as soon as the policy was implemented, the black market rate for the dollar would explode, eventually reaching over 300 Cuban pesos to the dollar, not 24. The wage increases given out to state workers were virtually wiped out overnight by the reality of inflation. Prices in state stores, which had been converted from CUC to CUP at the official 24-to-1 rate, were suddenly astronomically high for a population whose salaries were now worthless. This created a massive gap between the official economy and the reality of the street, where everything was priced in dollars or at the black market rate. Overall, my friends, this entire thing was a massive wealth confiscation event at its finest, or I should say worst. The savings of ordinary Cubans held in CUP were rendered almost worthless overnight. The middle class of professionals, the doctors, engineers, and teachers, would see their life savings evaporate like that. This singular event destroyed what little social trust people had in the government's economic competence, and this was one of the primary driving factors of the July 11th, 2021 protests, which the government responded to with brutal efficiency. cracking down on them and arresting over 1,300 people. Since then, my friends, since 2021, the crisis has only deepened, something that went from an acute shock to a chronic systemic failure. The government has at this point largely abandoned any pretense of a recovery plan and is now more focused on managing the decline of the country. Perhaps the most visible and obvious sign of the crisis, is the apagones, or the blackouts. When I'm talking about this, they're not just due to the aging infrastructure, with many of the varying different power production facilities being 50 or 60 years old. They are a direct result of Cuba's inability to pay for even fuel and spare parts. In 2023 to 2024, blackouts of 12 to 18 hours a day were the norm, especially outside of Havana, which in turn had a cascading effect. Remember, no electricity means no production in factories, no internet for new private businesses, no refrigeration for food, which already there was very little food, so when the little food you had was spoiling very quickly, it meant even less food. Effectively, economic paralysis in the modern day and age was the new reality. This would make daily life difficult, if not impossible. Food spoils, water pumps stop working, heat becomes unbearable. From here, the combination of the energy crisis and the lack of inputs would destroy domestic agriculture. Farmers would have no diesel for tractors or irrigation pumps, instead going back to animal-based agriculture if they could even afford that, though of course production became far more limited. The state had no dollars to import fertilizer, pesticides, or even basic foodstuffs to supplement the meager local harvests. And remember, most food had to be imported to the island despite 60 years of the government attempting self-sufficiency. The Libreta de Raciones, the ration book, which used to guarantee a basic basket of goods, would now provide almost nothing and often arrive late. Cubans would spend an estimated 70 to 80% of their income just to try and find food on the black market. All those promises for decades of free, high-quality healthcare, high-quality and free education, all of these things for their social services would end up hollow when there was no food to buy in the first place, and the highly educated wages would not pay for it anyway, even if it was there. To put that into perspective, a doctor earning the equivalent of $25 a month could earn over $10,000 a month in Spain or Latin America. As a result, over 1 million Cubans, over 10% of the population, a disproportionate number of them being the young and educated, the cream of the crop of Cuban society, would flee since 2021. This would leave hospitals understaffed, schools without teachers, factories without workers. Even if they do have workers, pharmacies are oftentimes just empty, and hospitals lack basic antibiotics, anesthetics, or even sutures. Patients are oftentimes required to bring their own sheets, soap, and food for their stay in the hospital. It is overall terrible, but the state can't really do anything to stop it, and instead of reform, they only try to limit or control the collapse. As an example of this, think of the stat that I gave here just a second ago of over 1 million Cubans fleeing the country. By tacitly allowing its citizens to leave, the government ends up removing the most dissatisfied and desperate elements of the population, which reduces the risk of another large-scale uprising. Even if it does not help productivity, it reduces internal threats. The crackdown following the July 11th and other protests in 2024 would later send a clear message to those that remained that dissent was not going to be tolerated. To that end, President Diaz-Canel would later say in a public address reiterating this that, quote, such actions will be prosecuted with the rigor that the revolutionary laws contemplate, end quote. Yeah, but now that, my friends, that finally brings us to where it is that we are here today, in 2026. Now that former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is in US captivity and a more compliant government is in charge in Caracas, attention has very quickly been drawn to Cuba. On January 3rd, 2026, within hours of the successful execution of Operation Midnight Hammer, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who himself is a son of Cuban immigrants who came to the US pursuing the American dream, would go on to say, quote, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit, end quote. Just one day after this, Rubio would reiterate the warning to Cuba, saying, quote, they're in a lot of trouble. And also, I'm not going to talk to you about what our future steps are going to be and our policies are going to be right now in this regard, but I don't think it's any mystery that we are not big fans of the Cuban regime, who, by the way, are the ones that were propping up Maduro. End quote. And yes, this is true. They absolutely were. Rubio would go on to note how Maduro's personal bodyguards were Cubans. Like, his own bodyguard force were not his own people because Maduro could not trust them to not turn on him. He had to actually employ Cuban bodyguards. Bodyguards, which subsequently ended up being returned back to Cuba in little boxes. Yeah. As it is, my friends, incidentally, Rubio has been a long-time Cuban hawk, if you will, and has for years pursued regime change in Havana. And with what is going on, it seems now that his dream is closer to reality than ever. Because when I am talking about this, Trump's ultimate goal here seems to be to reassert America's position on the world stage. But more importantly, it is to secure its position in the Western Hemisphere, with the whole thing effectively being America's exclusive economic zone. This is essentially his modern version of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, which has been recast as the Donroe Doctrine by Trump, but arguably this is something that could not be fulfilled by the presence of hostile forces such as Venezuela and Cuba, providing spaces to Washington's adversaries, such as China and Russia. Venezuela is not exactly a problem anymore, which means that all that is really left is Cuba. According to some news sources, such as the Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration is seeking regime change in Havana by the end of this year. While yes, the US has pursued regime change in Cuba for over 7 decades now, with every attempt having been a failure, which on that note, I saw some memes talking about this that were like, Operation It Can't Go Wrong a second time. It's, yeah, I can only imagine how fire the memes are going to be if it actually takes place. But this is perhaps a golden opportunity for such an endeavor for several reasons. From everything that I have described, if you have watched the course of this video, you would understand that in the year 2026, Cuba simply does not have many friends. Even less now with Maduro having been captured. And with Russia still occupied with Ukraine, China is arguably the only country that could theoretically come to Cuba's rescue. And yes, both countries, both China and Russia, have pledged support, but Russia merely sent their interior minister, Vladimir Kolotsev, for a visit this past week to meet with the Cuban president and military, while Beijing would commit $80 million in aid. It is something, yes, but after the Venezuela operation, it is doubtful if either Beijing or Moscow could even hope to try to challenge US power in the Western Hemisphere. Such a thing would likely be impossible. So, with that being considered, Cuba is on its own for the most part, now more than ever in its history, with the exception of during the special period. The loss of Venezuela is going to hurt it dearly, as it was getting subsidized oil from Caracas for the last 26 years. After Maduro's capture, Trump would warn that no more oil was going to reach Cuba, saying, and I quote on his Truth Social platform on January 11th, "There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. I strongly suggest they make a deal before it is too late." Cuba lived for many years on large amounts of oil and money from Venezuela. End quote. Which, yeah, that is true, and it just reiterates the points that I've made over the course of this video. As for what is actually going to happen, well, according to a Wall Street Journal report, the Trump administration is currently focusing on identifying someone inside of the Cuban government who would be willing to cut a deal with the US. Whether that will pan out, though, is uncertain. The pressure is going to keep increasing either way, both externally and internally. Cuba, being an island, means that the US could very easily enforce a full economic blockade of the country. Washington already has a significant naval deployment in the Caribbean around the Cuban islands, so it does not need to redeploy forces from elsewhere. US intelligence assessments have painted a grim picture of the island's economy, if, I haven't done so already over the course of this, which is plagued by chronic shortages of basic goods, medicines, and frequent blackouts, which shut the entire thing down. At the rate that things are going, within a month, it is estimated that the island nation could be completely out of oil, and this would send the sinking economy crashing into the sea. But again, the question remains, will the regime actually change on its own, or will something more drastic, like in the case of Venezuela's Maduro, need to be done? After all, a regime change in Cuba will not only fulfill the long-standing US dream from the Cold War era, it would also ensure Trump's name goes down in history as the president who finally ended the hostile communist regime right on the US's doorstep that aids its foes. It would be a huge deal. If successful, it would be arguably one of the greatest geopolitical successes in all of American history. But the key word there is if. Nothing is certain, of course. The Trump administration also realizes, despite its strong language, from Donnie, that it must proceed with caution, as history shows that Cuba is a very tough nut to crack. The chances of Cuba's government falling on its own are low, to put it mildly. And so, in the end here, my friends, I need to really explain that part because there's going to be a lot of people in the comments that are going to be predicting just doom and gloom. People love to focus on that specific part, but fail to understand the details that make such a collapse likely or even possible in the first place. In Cuba's case, it's hard to see something viable like you could with Venezuela's opposition parties. Opponents of the regime in Cuba are straight up not allowed to participate in the elections. It is a true one-party state, with the military and civilian leadership roles all being taken or given to ardent supporters. And with billions of dollars stolen over the years through nationalization and state-owned enterprises, there are various economic incentives for the current leadership to not give up power. They would lose everything, so why change? On top of that, it's not like they're not capable of stopping change. Repression of the population of Cuba is highly successful and even easy at this point. The few major protest movements that have taken place have all been ruthlessly crushed. There is no real opposition for said movements to support anyway. There is no leader to rally behind. There is no party to vote in. Nothing. Any attempt to make an opposition is watched and crushed by Cuba's massive intelligence network and secret police. So there's no real hint of an armed guerrilla movement or insurgency in the country that could overthrow things internally rapidly anyway. There is, simply right now, no real alternative or even the possibility of one developing quickly. So, as it is, my friends, Cuba may be a basket case, but even if it's not strong, it is more resilient than people give it credit for. The regime has survived numerous pressure campaigns before, including decades of sanctions, covert operations, economic instability, as we've covered all here before, and at the other end of the spectrum, it has even survived US efforts to negotiate under President Obama, which there was a time where that did happen. Small changes have taken place, yes, but those often mean little and are very easily reversed. The current situation is bad. Really, really bad, but not necessarily something that is worse than the start of the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union. It is very possible that what will take place will just be the 2.0 version of that until perhaps maybe years down the line, another power steps in to act as Cuba's life support again. As such, even if the best scenario for Trump is that the regime collapses under the pressure of renewed economic and oil blockades, the chances of that actually happening are iffy to say the least. So if it doesn't work, the Trump administration is preparing to take the next step, just like it did with Venezuela, as the Cuban regime is friendless, it's at its weakest in many decades, and is central to the success of the Dawn Road Doctrine. Only time will tell whether or not that will actually pan out, but you can bet that whatever does happen, we will be here to tell you the story of how it took place in the first place. And with that, my friends, we're going to go ahead and end things here today. Hopefully it's not too late, but we'll see how this goes. I get a lot of comments on my videos that say that, yes, this video is already out of date, but we'll see. Thank you all for watching. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that you'd like to see next, and I will see you all here later, my friends. Best of luck, and please don't let the world burn down. Goodbye, everyone.
Today's video is probably going to be a bit of a mess. In fact, it might even be a slow-moving train wreck. And that's because we're finally updating the water simulation here in Magnolia County. And that's because City Skylines 2 overhauled the water physics back in October with the Bridges and Ports update. But there was a catch. Those improvements only applied to new maps or saves that were manually upgraded. And up until now, I haven't done that. And the old simulation is rough. The water appears to be almost viscous, with a jello-like consistency that behaves erratically, and it's basically impossible to dam. And since we need to find a permanent fix for our constant flooding, and we need to replace all the bridges with ones that are tall enough to accommodate cargo ships, I figured today's the perfect time to finally tackle this challenge. We'll start out by upgrading the water simulation, and then we'll move on to replacing all the bridges, starting out in Bailey and working our way towards Bend. And by the end, if you've been curious about how to